All right, so we're going to talk about the Nintendo Switch 2 today and some of the leaks, as well as the first look video that they put out recently. Going to be kind of reacting to that, kind of pointing some things out. And then we're going to talk about those leaks because the hardware leaks are very interesting to consider because it is considerably more powerful than the Switch. And I'm doing some comparisons against like desktop hardware and some other hardware that you might find pretty interesting. So let's just jump right into it and take a look at this video first. So right off the bat, you can see the original Switch, and it's going to morph in a second here to the new one. There's some interesting things in that alone that I wanted to talk about. Like, for instance, obviously new finish, but this is the important part, is they've completely overhauled it, and it looks an awful lot like the Steam Deck. They've added buttons, they've added ports, they've added all this features and functionality that are in more of a PC handheld than the Switch 1. So I think they're taking some notes from Valve here, trying to get this thing more in line with that. Also, you can see the Joy-Cons are considerably bigger. They're supposedly drift-free. These new analog controllers are supposedly going to be drift-free, so no more drift problem with the Switch Joy-Cons. And then the actual connector is interesting because it looks like it just plugs right in, but I'm skeptical as to how reliable that is. Like, if it's just a port that plugs in, I can see like people losing their Joy-Cons because they're not anchored properly to the Switch, but I can't imagine Nintendo didn't think of that. I'm sure there's some kind of locking mechanism. I think that little thing at the top there might be some kind of locking mechanism to keep them clamped into the Switch unless you push like a button to release it. But that's the theory that I have running. It is considerably bigger. It is considerably faster, and we're gonna get into that in a moment. But yeah, it's oh, you know what? I just noticed something. So you can see there's little buttons. So below the paddles, you can see those little buttons on the Joy-Cons. I wonder if that's like a release switch to let it go from the actual Switch unit. So yeah, I'll bet you that's what that is. So that actually locks it in so that you're not losing them, because if it's just a port that plugs in, I mean, if you think of like a USB port, even, the tightest USB port you can imagine, it still pulls right out. So I can imagine that that's probably some kind of locking mechanism to keep them plugged into that Switch so that they don't go flying off. So that's cool. Didn't notice that the first time I watched this, but I just noticed it now. So there you go. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting, and the rumor is there's gonna be a new Mario Kart, or I think that might be official now, Mario Kart 9. So yeah, that's gonna be interesting because that's their biggest seller beyond a shadow of a doubt, and that's gonna be a console seller without a question. And then obviously this is the other big news in my opinion. Playing Nintendo Switch games on the Switch 2. So they've got backwards compatibility with the Switch 1. That is brilliant. That is the smartest move they could have made, because that allows people to, take their library with them. And it's probably the most important thing you can have in a console these days, is to have that level of backwards compatibility. And I know that they kind of hand waved it with like, emulated stuff of old consoles with like, even back as far as the Wii, they started doing that. And the Wii had GameCube compatibility, but they never really put a lot of stock into that, especially with their handhelds. It kind of jumped, and then they kind of lost some things along the way. But there was some attention to backwards compatibility. I hope that this is their new approach. Like the Switch 3 will be Switch 2 and 1 compatible. Like they just keep advancing the same hardware platform and continue on with this, because I think that's probably the smartest thing they could do. Is release after release, if they continue to maintain that compatibility backwards, you're talking about a whole new ecosystem here, because this is basically putting it in competition with the Steam Deck. You've got effectively competing libraries now, not so much hardware, where the Steam Deck, you have your Steam library, and Nintendo Switch, you have your Switch library, and you're going to be building that up over time. In theory, even being able to play those old Switch 1 games on like the Switch 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever hardware they're calling it, as long as they maintain that chain, I think that's the smartest move they could make. So this is a good first step, a good step in the right direction to maintain that compatibility. So yeah, that's some interesting stuff, and that is the thing they dropped. We're going to be finding out more really soon here with the Nintendo Direct, it sounds like. So I'm sure I'll be doing a video on that too. And yeah, so there's the video. Now let's switch on over to some of these rumors that they didn't talk about that other people did. So Nintendo Switch 2 leak reveals RTX 30 series architecture with potential for DLSS and ray tracing. So a lot of people are saying this is like an RTX 3050 mobile. And to a certain degree, I guess you're right. I've got some other comparisons I'd like to make. Especially being an indie developer, my mentality is hardware as close to the benchmarks that we're seeing here as possible, and the RTX 30 mobile is not that. There are better options for me as far as targeting that hardware without actually having that hardware. And I do have the ability to do that, so we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's just talk about the leaks here. Technical specs: ARM Cortex A78C, 8 cores, and I guess the 8 cores are divided into like 3 segments. There's like a highly powerful, a mid-range, and then the low-tier cores. So that's going to be interesting to hear about. And the NVIDIA T239 Ampere RTX 30 series, 1 GPU cluster, 12 streaming multiprocessors, 1534 CUDA cores, 6 texture processing clusters, 48 Gen 3 tensor cores, 2 RTX ray tracing cores. Now, I honestly don't see how many games are going to be targeting that ray tracing on the Switch. The Switch is a different world. Now, there is potential there to have some ray tracing, but I think by and large, most Switch games are not going to be targeting that. That is more of an artistic choice at this point. It was kind of like, RTX went through the same thing that all these other technologies went through. Like my big go-to is Bloom. Everybody was using Bloom, and it was overcranked, and it was insane. And then people started scaling it back and making more artistic choices in that respect. And I think RTX, at least ray tracing in general, is going to be one of those things where you might not use it because you're going to be targeting a more cartoony aspect, or if you're targeting that cartoony aspect, you're using ray tracing in a different way, much more subdued. So there are going to be, scales of that, and I don't think the Switch is going to be targeting a lot of it because the Switch games are designed to be mobile. They're designed to be a whole different world, and ray tracing doesn't quite fit into that yet. But having the cores there, it's not a bad idea. So going forward here, 12 gigs of RAM, 2 6-gig chips. That's not too bad, especially for a handheld. CPU is going to be 1.1 gigahertz. GPU 561 megahertz, 1.72 teraflops peak. RAM at 2133 megahertz, 68.26 gigabytes a second peak bandwidth. At docked, it's going to be 900 megahertz. For the CPU, GPU is 1007 megahertz, 3.09 teraflops peak. And those are important numbers, that 3.09 and that 1.72. We're going to get into that in a minute. RAM is going to be running clocked up at 3200 megahertz. 102.4 gigabytes per second peak bandwidth. So you're getting faster RAM, higher output GPU, and slightly lower CPU, which is interesting to see. I don't know if maybe these numbers were reversed, because usually when you're in handheld mode, you downclock the CPU. So I'll bet you that's just a mistake, and it's actually 900 and 1100 respectively in docked. Other things we can talk about, obviously we talked about these before, with the CPU, the GPU, and the RAM. Yeah, that's pretty much it for this article. But we're going to talk a little more in detail about it. I also included this article, which I'll talked a little bit about the cores. So, 3-tiered hybrid CPU consisting of 1 ARM Cortex X1 HP core, 3 Cortex A78P cores, 4 Cortex A55E cores with ARM Dynamic IQ, a hardware-based schedule. The iGPU the T239 is based on the Ampere graphics architecture with 12 streaming multiprocessors with 1536 CUDA cores. We talked about that before. And the 12 gigs of LPDDR5X 7500 memory. Console uses UFS 3.1 base 256 gigabyte flash solution. So 256 gigs of storage. That's not bad. that's a pretty standard tier for Steam Deck. So I keep making these Steam Deck comparisons because I think that's its biggest competitor at this point is Steam Deck and Steam OS powered handhelds, which are starting to come into their own at this point, outside of Valve. As for the device itself, the prototype 270 millimeters, 116 and 14. So it's considerably larger than the old Switch. The screen is 8 inches compared to 7 inches. And I've heard rumors, now it didn't say that in this article, but I've heard rumors that it's going to be running 1080p, the screen itself, and then obviously docked, it's going to be able to run 1080p. I would not be surprised if they could up this to a 4K output. I don't know. I mean, I can imagine the ability for the Switch 2 to run 4K. Nobody's talked about it that I've seen, but it's going to be something that could be a potential for the Switch 2. It might be a bit of a push for that mobile hardware to be able to get that 4K output and have the gaming performance it needs to have. Given the GPU is like a the equivalent of a 3050 mobile, I don't know how well it's going to do gaming at 4K, but we'll see. I mean, its potential is there, and certainly with, optimizations in GPUs that have been made in the last few years, it's not off the table, I would say. So going out to the hardware comparisons, like I said, a lot of people are comparing this to a 3050 mobile, 3050A mobile. Now, if you remember, let's go back here. There we go. 1.72 teraflops and 3.09. So a little under 2 and a little over 3. And this is clocking in at 4 teraflops. So this is this mobile processor, this 3050 mobile, is actually going to be outputting more floating point operations than even in docked mode. So the comparison is, as from a technological perspective, it's similar technologically, but as far as the output is concerned, as far as the end result is concerned, I would not be targeting a 3050 mobile. I would actually be looking more towards a 1050 and a 1060. The 1050 would be the equivalent of it standalone. The 1060 3GB would be the equivalent of it docked. So those are the two pieces of hardware that I would be comparing it to as far as pushing pixels. Obviously, the technology is way better. There's new features in the Switch 2 that these guys don't have at all. I mean, they don't even have RTX. So there's that equivalent. But I think that if you're developing a game, this is the target that you'd want to push. You'd want to turn off that RTX and see what your game can do with these, because the like I said, the 1050 is 1.862. That's very close to that 1.7. Where did it go? There it is, 1.72. So 1.72 versus 1.862, very close. And then the 3.09 is comparable to the 1060, which is 3.935. It's still a little high. But honestly, I mean, I wouldn't even bother with this. I would go for that, that 1050, because you want to have your game operate very effectively undocked, and then start targeting like features you can turn on when it's docked. But again, the important thing, in my opinion, is that 1050, and then you can start, getting it functional at that level, and then move towards getting some real hardware, getting the Switch 2 in your hands, and start tweaking it so that you turn on features that would be compatible and capable on the Switch 2 in docked mode. But you could crank out a 1050 and start working on a game right now, and if you target a 1050, it'll work like butter on the Switch undocked. The other piece of hardware that I'm really more interested in is the Switch, or the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is very similar to the Switch 2 in terms of performance undocked. 1.638 teraflops, floating point 32, and like I said, 1.72 teraflops peak on the Switch 2. So if I was to pick a piece of hardware that I have laying around, it's going to be the Steam Deck, because I got one right here, and docking the Steam Deck doesn't really do much in terms of amping up that power, because it's different. Now I could see the Steam Deck 2, if they come out with a new one, pushing Switch 2 numbers undocked, docked Switch 2 numbers undocked on the Steam Deck, but at the current rate, 1.638, that's a great target. That's perfect to get that Switch 2 performance out of a game that you're developing. So, I mean, how many developers have the Steam Deck just to make it compatible with Steam Deck, and how many games are out there that are already Steam Deck compatible that would just naturally make the switch over to Switch 2? That would be a fairly easy thing to do performance-wise. Now, game by game, it depends on the architecture and how it's built and what it's built in, how difficult it would be to port. But, for an indie developer, Unity, Unreal, they work great on Switch, and they're going to work great on Switch too. So I don't think there's going to be any problem with a lot of these indie games coming over to Switch 2 and not having an issue, especially the ones that work on Steam Deck, because they've already got it hardware targeted to the performance specs that are needed for Switch 2. So that's an interesting comparison there, I think. Certainly something I'm going to be looking into, because, I mean, I was already looking at making it Steam Deck compatible, and that just by default, since I work in Unity, by default that makes it work great in Switch 2. So, Switch 2 outperforms it by even a little bit undocked. And like I said, newer architecture, newer hardware, by a little bit at least. And so you're going to have those extra features as well on that Switch 2 for that you don't have on the Steam Deck. But, given the reception that the deck has had, with the ability to just run practically freaking anything, I don't think we're going to have a problem with the Switch 2. I think that's going to open the door for a lot of potential, a lot of opportunities, and certainly, Nintendo is going to be the bottleneck itself, because Nintendo is very restrictive about what comes to their platform. You have to get it approved. That is not something that Steam does, but it's a different world. Nintendo is a different world from the PC gaming market. So it's an ecosystem onto itself. It's got its own thing, and it is very protective about what comes to that platform. Now, they've been a lot better about that with the Switch, and I would imagine that that's going to continue with the Switch too. So they're going to let a lot more things that they wouldn't have let fly on, like the Wii or the Wii U. The Switch is a whole different world. It's a whole different Nintendo making those decisions now than they were back in the day. So you could see a lot of potential here. I mean, I would hope that they would be more receptive to indie devs. They would have the bandwidth to deal with it, and still maintain their closed off ecosystem that is classic for Nintendo, because that's something that they shouldn't sacrifice too much. They have that, hey, everything in Nintendo is, kind of higher quality. It's gonna work well on our hardware because we verify that it is. We make sure that those games are gonna work great on our hardware because we've been burned in the past, and that's the Nintendo seal of quality back in the NES days. That has continued on in the culture of Nintendo, and they still have that today, and that's great. And I think that is one of their major selling points, is that level of quality that comes to their console. So yeah, there you go. There's the Nintendo Switch 2 rumors, the preview video, and we found something interesting out. I mean, look at that. It's got a little release switch on the back of those Joy-Cons, and now I lost where it was, but yeah, it's something else. It's quite a machine, and I think it's going to be just as powerful as the Switch. The whole rumor of, oh no, Nintendo is going to have another failure because they have a success and a failure and a success and a failure. But you got to think back. The Nintendo NES and the Super Nintendo were both massive successes. The Nintendo GameCube, and in fact, before it, the Nintendo 64, they were both failures. So they've had failures in a row. They've had successes in a row. I think that this is going to be a success. I think this is the Super Nintendo to the Switch 1. I think that's the equivalent. This is the NES and the SNES. I think they're gonna be on a roll, and maybe they'll make it 3. I would not be surprised if we see a video like this with a 3 there. In about a decade's time or so, give or take. I think they'll have 3 in a row, and that'll be a first for Nintendo. So that's what I got for you guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you like these kind of things, subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you guys later.